Welcome to the Thursday, August 8th, 2024 episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the show, Kamala Harris selects her running mate, Iowa Republicans launch attacks on the new Democratic ticket, and a 20-foot tall inflatable IUD tours Iowa. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Barton, Deputy Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, filling in this week for Aaron Murphy, who is enjoying Brat Summer. Oh, that should be Brat Summer. Aaron loves to fire up that grill. With me this week, Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Tom.
Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal. Hello, Jared.
Hello there, Tom.
And we have a special guest this week. Please give a warm On Iowa Politics welcome to Gazette Cedar Rapids government reporter Marissa Payne.
Thanks for having me. And I would say Aaron Murphy very much is Brat.
Okay. Marissa, I think for not only me, but our listeners, you might have to explain what that one is.
Oh, goodness. So there's a musician, Charlie XCX. She released an album this summer that is called Brat. It's kind of known for its neon green background and sort of like a 90s Arial-esque font. But basically, it's in the same family as Hot Girl Summer. Hopefully, we are all acquainted with that. But basically, Hot Girl Summer is just free to be yourself, loving yourself, whatever form you're in, however you come. And Brat is very similar, but like a little bit of a messier version of Hot Girl Summer. So embracing your mess.
Gotcha. Yes. Appreciate the explanation.
And brat summer is when you get all the brats out, put them on the grill, and have a good time.
Yes.
I feel like Aaron is probably definitely also enjoying brat summer.
All right. Well, let's get into it. First up this week, Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, picked Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate Tuesday as she looks to boost the ticket in the Midwest. Iowa Democrats praised Harris for turning to a Midwestern governor, military veteran, and union supporter who helped enact an ambitious Democratic agenda for his state, including sweeping protections for abortion rights, protecting rights of LGBTQ plus people from Minnesota and other states to receive gender-affirming health care, free school meals for all kids, regardless of family income, and enacting a paid family leave and medical leave program. In the days since President Joe Biden's decision to bow out of the race, there's been renewed enthusiasm and palpable excitement across the party, which we saw on display Wednesday, where Vice President Harris and Governor Walz spoke to packed venues and a tour of swing states. Jared, I want to start this discussion with you. Last week on the program, we all put our money on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro as who Harris would pick, a popular, more moderate leader of a crucial swing state to winning the White House. So first off, I guess, what did you make of Harris' pick of Walz and the fact that we were all completely wrong?
Well, our bet definitely paid off and paid off big time. And hopefully no one laid any money based off of what we said last week. It obviously was surprising, not just to all of us because we picked otherwise, but even some of the media coverage you saw on it seemed to be a little surprised that national media coverage seemed to be a little surprised that it was Walz instead of Shapiro. But it really does seem like the kind of pick that's a play to keep like the good vibes within the party going for even longer because of the base that Walz has as kind of like a more progressive sort of candidate who was able to get a lot done in a state that obviously now on the Republican side, Minnesota is getting painted as being just as liberal as California, but the Minnesota legislature is pretty evenly divided, and even with that, Walz has been able to, sign a lot of legislation into law that's pretty progressive. So that's something for, Democrats now to point to. And that's a that makes sense as a kind of person to run on a VP ticket, because you can say, well, you know, these policy goals may seem ambitious, but look, he was able to get them done in a place that is more divided than you might think, and was able to, you know, get some of those deals in place, and has that kind of a bipartisan streak.
Building off that, the Iowa House Minority Leader Jennifer Converse of Windsor Heights said that she believes that Walz's Midwestern background and kind of his happy warrior approach, or joyful warrior approach, you know, will help the ticket, and said that she thought that it energizes Iowa Democrats and no party voters who she said are fired up over protecting reproductive rights in public education. The Harris campaign said that it raised $36 million in the first 24 hours after she announced Walz as her running mate. And as I alluded to earlier, yesterday, 12,000 supporters turned out for a Harris Walz rally in rural Wisconsin, and I think another 15,000 supporters, I believe their largest crowd yet, in Detroit. So can Democrats carry forward the excitement through November and translate it into the votes that they need?
Well, maybe maybe in some of those key places. I was thinking about how much of an impact this would have in Iowa, and I don't know that, you know, the Walz pick in and of itself is going to have some kind of like coattail effect, you know, for down ballot Iowa races. But you know, the new boost of energy for the campaign overall could really help in some tighter races. You know, Biden staying in, which we talked about, was starting to seem like a real drag on Iowa Democrats running in competitive races, which is why before he stepped aside, we were starting to see Democrats in some of those races distancing themselves from the president, which isn't necessarily the case now. So, um, you know, nothing lasts forever in our news cycles anymore, and the excitement might wax and wane a little bit. But I think more than just Walz in and of himself, you know, this newfound excitement for the ticket overall, now that it's kind of cohered, it might help a point or two in closer races.
Yeah. So I did have a opportunity this week to speak with Democratic former Iowa U.S. Representative Dave Loebsack of Mount Vernon, who served with Walz in the U.S. House. They were both first-time candidates running in mostly rural districts who managed to unseat Republican incumbents in 2006. Loebsack said that Midwest Democrats have felt kind of left out in the cold by the national party. And that with Walz, Loebsack said that he sees an opportunity to amplify the voices of Democratic lawmakers and candidates in the heartland, where voters flocked to former President Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 and propped up vulnerable Republicans down ballot. Sarah, I guess I want to bring you into this conversation. I'm curious, what are Democrats in your neck of the woods saying about the Harris Walz ticket? And yeah, I guess, what are your top takeaways from Walz's introduction to the national stage?
Yeah, so I think Democrats here, like in other parts of the country, are really energized by a Harris Walz ticket. I think a lot of people were kind of expecting Shapiro to be, the pick, and so everybody is really learning a lot more about Walz throughout this process, and his record on the couple Democrats I've talked to about this were lawmakers. They were really impressed by his resume of being a teacher, having 20 plus years in the National Guard, just being a Midwesterner and having that kind of Midwestern dad vibe, having those Midwestern values, and being a governor with executive experience, they all thought would be a real asset to Harris. And that, in case anything were to happen, if they end up being elected, that he, could assume the presidential responsibilities if called upon. And so in general, just like that, the ticket was energizing Iowa Democrats, and, bringing that public school background into the national stage. I mean, like in Iowa, the last year, there's been a lot of talk about public schools with the private school voucher plan. And so having having somebody who is a teacher, or was a teacher, I should say, and is on the national ticket, I think brings a lot of attention to public schools, and that's something that the couple Democrats I spoke with were excited about. That, and then also his messaging. He's pioneered the weird punchline, and being kind of plain spoken and quick to call nonsense was one lawmaker I spoke to referred to him.
Yeah, when you say weird punchline, mean referring to Donald Trump and JD Vance as being weird or I guess out of touch, which
Right.
obviously Republicans now are trying to use that same brush with Tim Walz and with the vice president. Moving on, but sticking with the Harris-Walz ticket, Iowa Republicans railed against the ticket as radical. Not a surprise. The Republican Party of Iowa Chairman Jeff Kaufman criticizing Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's snub as, quote, blatantly anti-Semitic. Marissa, you attended an Iowa GOP reception this week in Cedar Rapids where Iowa Republicans hammered Vice President Harris in her selection of Governor Walz as her running mate for the White House. What did the Iowa GOP leaders have to say of Harris' pick of Tim Walz?
GOP Chair Jeff Kaufman was very critical. As you mentioned, he called it blatantly anti-Semitic to snub Josh Shapiro for her VP pick, and essentially suggested that he was the clear brightest choice to make, being a more moderate, popular leader of a swing state that'll be crucial to the election. He suggested that as a Republican, he's happy because Tim Walz will be easier to beat. They can kind of more effectively message that because of his progressive agenda in Minnesota, he and Vice President Harris are very radical. But he said that the story behind this VP selection was as blatantly anti-Semitic as anything you could ever see or think about. So Kaufman was kind of hammering on that, and the other Republicans there was Ashley Hinson, Joni Ernst, Chuck Grassley, Terry Branstad, and Ashley Hinson criticized his record on sort of this trans refuge law that was passed in Minnesota, and criticizing this law. She said that it allows kids to be taken away from parents if they don't consent to hormone therapy or gender affirming care. And she called it reckless and irresponsible. Just to contextualize that, gender affirming care is seen as a life-saving measure for, that improves mental health outcomes in LGBTQ youth, allowing them to kind of live as the identity that they would prefer to live. And that they identify with. But this Minnesota law, Minnesota is essentially considered a sanctuary state for transgender and non-binary people, so it won't enforce other kind of anti-trans laws that other states have on the books. Specifically to Hinson's criticism, the bill that Walz signed grants Minnesota temporary emergency jurisdiction over custody disputes where a child can't access gender-affirming care. Say, for instance, a parent looks to relocate their child to a state that would block their medication. So there was a lot of that going on Tuesday night, whereas perhaps overstating, the radicalism of Walz policies in Minnesota.
I really don't think this line of attack is going to be around for much longer. It feels like one of those lines the campaign pulls out early when it's still trying to figure out like the main line of attack for an opponent. I'd be surprised if we're hearing about the pick being anti-Semitic in a month. Partially, I'd be surprised because, like I was saying before, it's really hard for anything to have longevity these days. But also, it's a line of attack that really risks allowing for Democrats to immediately mention instances that could be painted as anti-Semitic for Republicans, including former President Donald Trump having dinner with Kanye West, who's defended Hitler, and Nick Fuentes, who is a Holocaust denier and has said that he wants a total Aryan victory. So the longer you have, that kind of anti-Semitism question lingering around, the more it risks those kind of attacks for your own side.
That's a very good point, and something that I was going to ask, I guess, the panel about. So it's clear Republicans are trying to stir up kind of the bitter divisions over the Israel-Hamas war to disrupt kind of a rare moment of Democratic unity. But again, how are voters supposed to believe that a woman who is married to a Jewish man is anti-Semitic? Vice President Harris, her husband, is Jewish. Marissa, what did Kaufman have to say to that?
Yeah, so when I asked him after the event, pointed out that she has a Jewish husband, and here's what he had to say. Do you stand by those remarks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and the decision of vice president is not just that of the actual candidate. We see that's getting the feedback of activists. That's getting the feedback of Democrats and Democratic leaders all over. All you have to do is just a simple Google search on what people are thinking when she was seriously considering Shapiro, and you have multiple examples of them saying this is going to be problems with our party. This is going to create issues for you.
Now, Marissa, you don't think that if the Democrats had picked Josh Shapiro, that Jeff Kaufman wouldn't be hammering that pick as well, do you? He would have just, if the pick had been Shapiro, it would have been totally fine, and he would have praised the move.
Well, he said he was getting a little bit nervous about the prospect of Josh Shapiro.
Tim Walz, this is great. I mean, he's radical. He's California crazy. As far as the selection of Shapiro, I'm glad from a political point she hasn't done it. I'm a little bit worried about the reasoning and about elements in your party that are so radical you can actually push a decision that seems to be counterintuitive to doing the right thing.
Even though Jeff Kaufman is trying to frame this as easier for Republicans to beat because they can message about the radicalism of this ticket, I think it'll be an interesting test of, when you energize more progressive voters and you actually present a vision, because as we mentioned, so many people are excited about just the accomplishments of Tim Walz in Minnesota. When you present a vision for the future and you think about the prospect of taking what Walz has done in Minnesota across the whole nation, is that enough to energize voters? And it's hard to say because just from the Biden campaign, we haven't had that sort of energy in so long. So we'll see what the GOP does, depending on how Democratic voters react.
All right. Next up, an inflatable IUD named Frida Woom, fresh from an appearance at Lollapalooza in Chicago, took her Hot Girl Summer Tour to Iowa this weekend to promote contraception access. The inflatable intrauterine device stopped in Iowa were part of a national campaign organized by Americans for Contraception that has a national campaign promoting protecting the rights to contraception amid a growing partisan clash over reproductive rights in the wake of the U.S. Supreme Court's 2022 decision overturning a federally protected right to abortion. Cedar Rapids area lawmakers criticized Iowa Republicans for not supporting legislation at both the state and federal levels introduced by Democrats to codify the right to access and obtain contraception. Republicans who said they support adult women's access to over-the-counter birth control said the provisions were too broad and offered their own legislation to allow easier access and quicker approval for oral contraceptive drugs without a prescription. Iowa Republican U.S. Senators Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley, who voted against the Democratic-led efforts to provide nationwide protections for birth control access and federal protections for in vitro fertilization, accused Democrats of, quote, a shameless campaign of fear-mongering and scare tactics, end quotes. And the pair contend that contraception and IVF are legal in every state and that they support nationwide access to both. Sarah, I'm curious, how are candidates and lawmakers in your neck of the woods positioning themselves on this issue? And is this something that voters are thinking about? Is it top of mind for them?
There hasn't really been a lot of campaigning specifically on this issue yet. I think at least locally, we're still kind of in the early phases of campaigning for the November election, but certainly Democrats have talked about, in the context of abortion, wanting to protect IVF treatments and access to contraception, and kind of painting Republicans as wanting to take that away. And I don't think we've seen really Republicans out and about their, positions specifically on IVF, but to my knowledge, there aren't any efforts in Iowa to try to ban IVF. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast. Democrats have taken out a billboards, like right outside the Times building on a busy thoroughfare, with the faces of several of the Republican lawmakers that voted for the fetal heartbeat bill. So certainly Democrats are like talking about reproductive health care as an issue, and they're positioning themselves as, they're wanting to protect rights to reproductive health care, and Republicans don't. So that's what I've seen so far. I have not seen anything from Republicans locally about IVF.
Sorry, just really quickly. So to your question about, whether there have been attacks on IVF in Iowa, abortion rights advocates and Democrats point to legislation that passed the House but got held up in the Iowa Senate, related to enhancing penalties for the non-consensual termination of a pregnancy, and that there was wording in that legislation that talked about life beginning at conception or life beginning at fertilization. They also point to legislation supported by Republicans, both this year and in previous legislative sessions, that would establish that life begins at conception. And there was legislation that I believe was passed in 2019 that had kind of similar wording, and they point to issues in other states, notably Alabama, where they've passed legislation like that, and it led to a court ruling from the Alabama Supreme Court, saying that because of that legislation, embryos that are created, stored, and discarded as a course of fertility treatment in IVF, have the rights of a child, and obviously that became a big flashpoint this year across the country and across the nation, with a lot of people sounding alarms about threats to IVF because of legislation like that. But anyway,
Yeah, going back to our Walz discussion from earlier, he's someone that can message quite a bit on that particular issue of IVF, because him and his wife had their daughter Hope through in vitro fertilization, so he can like personalize that kind of story if this bubbles up again, kind of in the discourse.
Marissa, you're here in Cedar Rapids, where Frida Womb stopped. What did you make of the giant IUD and its moniker?
It's an entertaining, amusing name. You kind of chuckle a bit seeing the headlines. But I think for Democrats, this is an interesting way of kind of putting front and center, just the messaging around IVF specifically. A lot of the focus has been on abortion, but then, Republicans are struggling a little more to kind of toe, exactly where the messaging is on IVF when they want to be pro-life. But also there are inherent risks involved as a medical provider of, providing IVF and helping people conceive that way. So, when they're introducing some of these bills, like what Tom mentioned, it's a little challenging to, adamantly say Republicans are pro-life when such legislation providers say would, kind of inhibit that. So it is a interesting, intelligent way for Democrats to kind of put that front and center. It's hard to say, are voters seeing all of this? But I like the fact that it was at Lollapalooza, getting it out there in front of young voters who may be energized by such a message, especially to Jared's point. Walz is an effective messenger because of his personal experience. So, maybe kind of the combination of getting this display out in front of various audiences, younger audiences, combined with the energy of the new Democratic ticket can keep it top of mind.
Yeah. I'm curious, and I wonder, I guess, how effective is it as a symbol of the issue? I guess I wonder how many people would be able to look at it and be like, oh, that's an IUD, or wondering like, what is that?
I would have the same question. I don't know exactly how effective it'll be. I don't know if you look at that and inherently understand what it is, but at the very least, seeing a display like that would jog some questions, and it may prompt people to better understand the messaging.
Lastly, this week, Iowa Democratic U.S. House candidate Christina Bohannon is making abortion rights a central issue for voters in her renewed bid to unseat Republican U.S. Representative McNett Miller Meeks. Bohannon this week launched her first campaign ad of the election cycle, attacking Miller Meeks over abortion. Bohannon, a former state lawmaker and University of Iowa law professor, is vying for Southeast Iowa's first congressional district seat. In the ad, Bohannon ties Miller Meeks to an Iowa law backed by Republicans that recently took effect, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, that bans most abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. In the ad, Bohannon says, quote, Iowa now has one of the strictest abortion bans in the country because of Marionette Miller Meeks, end quote. Miller Meeks, a former Iowa state senator, did not serve in the Iowa legislature when lawmakers last year, during a rare special session, passed the new law banning abortions once cardiac activity can be detected. Bohannon contends that Miller Meeks laid the groundwork to ban abortion in Iowa. While in the Iowa Senate, Miller Meeks voted for anti-abortion rights legislation, including a constitutional amendment declaring that there is no right to an abortion in the state. The former practicing ophthalmologist and licensed physician from Ottumwa has applauded the U.S. Supreme Court's 2022 ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade, putting abortion abortion regulations back into the hands of the states. Miller Meeks contends that Christina Bohannon is, quote, blatantly misrepresenting her record, and says that she is pro-life, with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. Sarah, what did you make of the Bohannon ad? How effective is it, and how persuasive is her argument to voters that Miller Meeks is responsible for Iowa's restrictive abortion ban?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So yeah, in the ad, she cites that Iowa's near total abortion ban and says that it's because of Miller Meeks. And so I think that obviously she's trying to kind of simplify the issue, tie this unpopular abortion positions directly to Miller Meeks, like, you do not have abortion access because of my opponent. So that's obviously what she's trying to do. But as you pointed out, Miller Meeks was not in the Senate in 2023 when this was passed. She was not in the Iowa Senate in 2018 when it first passed, or she first started serving in 2019. So I think, it's a little, technically it's not really correct to say that, this ban came into effect because of Miller Meeks, because she didn't vote for it. However, she has taken anti-abortion stances. Like you said, she voted for that constitutional amendment. And I think it is safe to assume that she probably would have voted for the heartbeat bill had she been in the Senate at the time. I was kind of surprised to see that in the ad, Bohannon mentions her opponent specifically. I thought maybe her attack ads would be more, here's my position on abortion rights. My opponent has done this, supported this, and this. I think it'll be interesting to see how voters react to that. If they come away confused by the ad, or if they really react to that message of, okay, associating Marionette Miller Meeks with the anti-abortion stance. But I do think something gets a little lost when you say this ban is because of Miller Meeks, because while she has voted for anti-abortion policies and legislation, she did not specifically vote for this law that Bohannon mentions in the ad. So, but I think we'll definitely see more attack ads and lines along this issue, especially as patients start to really feel the impact of this bill. You know, not everybody follows politics super closely, but if you or someone you know is like, oh shoot, we're really impacted by this bill, and you can, you know, once people start paying more attention to that, we'll see how well Bohannon can tie Miller Meeks to that issue.
I also wanted to circle back a bit to our previous discussion. So last year at about this time, Congresswoman Marionette Miller Meeks had barely opened a town hall in Iowa City to questions when she was pressed to defend her opposition to abortion rights. She responded, quote, "One of the main functions of the federal government is to protect life," end quote. She then quickly pivoted to politically safer terrain, talking about how she had also sponsored legislation aimed at expanding access to contraception, talking about how the best way to prevent abortion is to prevent pregnancy. It seems an increasingly common strategy among vulnerable House Republicans, especially those in politically competitive districts like Miller Meeks, who are trying to reconcile their party's hardline anti-abortion policies with the views of voters in their districts, particularly independents and women. I guess I'm curious, how has that resonated with voters in the district, and how convincing has she been reconciling her past support for legislation that says life begins at fertilization, which would ban all abortions without exceptions, or excuse me, would ban all abortions without the exceptions for rape, incest, the woman's life, or fertility treatments that she says she supports?
Yeah, I think for Marionette Miller Meeks, abortion is kind of a sticky subject for her because just in this past June primary, she drew a primary opponent who said that she's flip-flopped on her stance on abortion and that she's too supportive of abortion. And so now, you know, going into the general election, she's you know, supports too strict of restrictions on abortion. So I think it's definitely a tough subject for Marionette Miller Meeks, and it's hard to say what is resonating with voters in the district, because I do think the baseline voter is, especially if the baseline voter who, you know, if abortion is among their top issues, they're probably going to be casting a vote for a Democrat if abortion is their top issue, because that's the Democrats have laid out their position on abortion is to protect abortion rights, and Republicans generally have laid out their positions as against or as anti-abortion. And so I think that that's probably where, if abortion is your top issue, you're probably not going to be splitting hairs over whether Marionette Miller Meeks is like supportive of contraception or not. But I do think it's interesting if you look at the Des Moines Register's most recent Iowa polling, if in the Southeast Iowa district was the only district where if voters were asked, you know, would you support a Democrat or Republican? The Democrat was like slightly above the Republican. And this was the only district where that was the case. And that was in March, I believe. That obviously doesn't speak to the candidates and the issues and the messaging, but it is just indicative of this kind of tightrope that Marionette Miller Meeks has to walk.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. All right. Well, that's it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. If you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice or on YouTube, where you should also smash that like button. You also can find the podcast each week on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. And now that you've listened to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For Sarah Watson, Jared McNett, Marissa Payne, and our producer, Bailey Cichon, I'm Tom Barton. Thanks for listening.